In your book, you're writing about clinical trials, and you give us samples of two ladies, two girls from Denmark.
Right.
How they went through these clinical trials, but they were not aware that they received something they didn't know, and they found out later, and they said they had some adverse reactions. Can you tell us these details about the story?
We just have to remember, Andrea, that the pharmaceutical industry makes billions of dollars, and they make billions of dollars by assuring people everything they do is safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective. So before it came on the market in the United States, there were clinical trials in Denmark. Two young women were going to get a few $100s. They were students. They thought, great, I'll get some money. They were told in their documentation that the shots had already been proven safe. That was a lie. It also said that the placebo in the control, in the experiment, was going to be salt water. Saltvand was the word in Danish. That was also a lie. They never, in the clinical trials, they did not use true placebos for any group. And we can come back to that. And both these young women developed very serious adverse reactions, which they didn't really understand because the people in the clinical trial, the healthcare practitioners, didn't understand that they were adverse events. So they both had severe autoimmune conditions that lasted for many years. They had to drop out of school. They had to drop out of their work. It had huge, huge adverse impacts on their lives. And they ultimately, through a film that was shown in Denmark, they met one another. They created a kind of a support group. Very fortunate in Denmark, Dr. Mielsen actually put together clinics for all of the young people who were injured by the HPV vaccines, and there was some medical assistance for these people.
You want to say there is even a clinic specialized for injured from HPV vaccine in Denmark?
Denmark, 5 clinics were set up around the country specifically for the young people who had been injured by these shots.
Can you explain us in details what they made wrong during the clinical trials about first, second, third, and then after that, how they decided to end trial, do it, I think I'm talking about these lesions. They decided that want to stop these lesions, not really cancers. These details are very important because here in Croatia, we believe documents from EMA, European Medical Agency. European Medical Agency receiving documents from the producers. But background, how they came to these documents, that is the thing that you explore and you put in the book. Please explain us.
So the clinical trials, Gardasil is the primary HPV vaccine in the world. Glaxo also has another one called Cervarix, but our book is primarily about Gardasil. And at that time, when this was going through the Food and Drug Administration in the United States in the early 2000s, they had just developed a fast-tracked procedure. We explain in the book that we don't believe that Gardasil should have been fast-tracked. Fast tracks means that they want to get a new medicine onto the market because there's nothing similar. There's nothing that does this wonderful thing that this new drug does. Well, there is a screening test. This shot is supposed to prevent cervical cancer, first and foremost. Pap screening absolutely works, right? Women go in every year, every 3 years. They look at the development of cells in the cervix inside, at the top of the vagina, at the bottom of the uterus, and they can tell if there's abnormal growth. So there was absolutely an alternative. Anyway, probably money talked in some way, and they fast-tracked this. So this was a very short period for the clinical trials. Cancer, cervical cancer in particular, typically takes decades to develop. The average age of a woman to get cervical cancer up until the advent of HPV vaccines was in her 50s. It was a woman who was not going for Pap screening. There were other risk factors like lots of pregnancies starting very early in life, smoking, lots of sexual partners, poor nutrition. Those are all the red flags that might predispose you to get cervical cancer. It's not a common cancer in the developed world, especially where women are going for screening. So they couldn't wait 30 years, Andrea, to make their money back. So they said, okay, we're going to look at cervical lesions. We're going to look at cervical intraepithelial lesions, CINs, which they have in different stages. The most important thing for people to understand is that the vast 99% of these cervical lesions disappear on their own. You have better nutrition, you stop smoking, you live in a better environment, it just disappears. It's very rare for these lesions to lead to cancer. But the clinical trials pretended as if you reverse the lesions, it's a proxy, it's the same as preventing cancer. That is a totally frankly, irrational assumption, but that's what the clinical trials did. But even more frightening and dangerous than that, Andrea, what the clinical trial data actually showed was that women who had active viral infections, human papilloma viral infections, or even if they had already cleared the infection, but they had antibodies to these 4 viral strains or 9 viral strains, they were more likely to reactivate that viral infection. And so literally in the clinical trials, there's information that shows that it reactivated the lesions or their cancers. And one of the many things that we've seen and reported after this came on the market is women would develop cervical cancer after taking a vaccine to prevent cervical cancer.
That means there were negative efficacy.
Exactly. They call it negative efficacy, which means basically it's giving you a new thing. Another incredible thing about the clinical trials is such a huge percentage. So they also, sorry, getting me going. So they didn't use, even though they pretended as if they used a true saline placebo in a very small group, they didn't even use a true saline placebo for any group. They used all of the things in the solution. They used the aluminum, they used the sodium borate, they used all of the things, and they just took out the viruses. And then in another group, so one group they kept in the aluminum, another group they took out the aluminum and they took out the antigen, but they still kept the carrier solution. So there wasn't a single group in the 20,000 that they used that had a true placebo in it. But so many of the girls, and in the clinical trials, it was almost all girls, not exclusively, and they were older than the group that actually was given the shots. But in those groups, there was a very high percentage, about a third of these young people would develop autoimmune conditions. So whether it was rheumatoid arthritis or it was called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or lots of different kinds of respiratory issues, gastrointestinal issues. They were developing what Merck then called new medical conditions. Instead of saying these are adverse effects to these vaccines and to the aluminum in the vaccines specifically, they called it new medical conditions, which again, we believe is just fraudulent. You know, these were adverse events that weren't characterized as that. Another thing that they did to kind of game the clinical trials is they would have very small groups around the world in different sites, so that instead of one doctor or one team of doctors having 1,000 people, and they could readily identify, oh my gosh, several people, a huge group are getting these problems, it would be spread out so they couldn't really tell what was happening. Many things were done to make sure that this new vaccine got onto the market, even though there were very, very serious red flags that there were real problems during the clinical trials.